Hey guys, so welcome to another episode of Earn Your Strength. Today I wanted to talk about what the posterior chain is, because I think there's a lot of confusion on what this system is and what it exactly does. So I thought it would first be a good idea to take a Google and just see what Google thinks the posterior chain is. So according to Google, and this is Wikipedia, the posterior chain is a group of muscles consisting predominantly of tendons and ligaments on the posterior of the body. Example of these muscles include the biceps femoris, gluteus maximus, erector spinae muscle group, trapezius, and posterior deltoids. Now, this isn't wrong, but what I want people to understand is that the posterior chain isn't actually an anatomical system. The posterior chain is a abbreviated term used to describe the superficial backline and the posterior oblique sling. Okay, two completely different systems that, although they serve slightly the same function, they're different systems and they can be trained in a different way. So whenever I say posterior chain to someone, immediately what they think of is a deadlift. And you're not wrong if you think of a deadlift, but a deadlift doesn't train the posterior chain per se, it trains the superficial backline. Okay, so we won't get into that just yet. I want to first discuss the history or where this posterior chain is coming from. So to properly do that, I thought it would be best to start from the beginning. So as most of you know, when you're born, you're in a very flexed position. You can see the child here. Obviously this isn't a real baby, but you can see the child here is in a very flexed position, and our body naturally caters a flexed position. That's why it's a lot more comfortable to go into a flexed position. And so from that position, developing through, childhood has come down to standing upright. And even as you go sort of into early childhood, you'll see that our bodies still cater a flexed position, and it is not until late in our development that we actually stand up. So in the beginning, the posterior chain, quote unquote, or the superficial backline, enables the child to lift its head to where it is. Okay, so that's its primary function. The superficial backline consists mostly of the erector spinae, the hamstrings, and the gastroc. Okay, and that is going to enable the child to lift its head. If that system wasn't involved, his head would drop and he wouldn't be able to see in front of him. And obviously, if you think about our species from a primal perspective, if you can't see in front of you, you're probably going to die. Okay, so moving on, as you grow into adolescence, you stand. And so when we think of a muscle that enables our body to become upright, you can't think of that system as anaerobic. It's very aerobic, it's very slow paced, it does very, very well with slow movements. It's a postural muscle. At its primary function, the superficial backline or the posterior chain is a postural muscle. It is what keeps us upright. Without that system, we would go into a natural state of flexion and we would fall forward at the hips. So from that, we can gather that training this system would be best done through postural development, correct? There's lots of exercises we can do for postural development, and we'll get to that a little later. I thought it would be good to illustrate the difference between the superficial backline and the posterior oblique sling, two systems that are largely put together and put into what the posterior chain is. Lots of pictures you'll see online of the posterior chain pretty much just shows the hamstrings, and then it shows some of the glutes and the latissimus dorsi. So two different functions. Like I said, the superficial backline is mostly postural, keeps us upright, makes us bipedal. That's what separates us from the monkeys, right? Where we can stand on 2 feet and we can walk. The posterior oblique sling, on the other hand, serves as a active function rather than sort of static. So the posterior oblique sling, as you'll see on the next slides, helps us walk and run. So the glute and the lats work in conjunction with each other to enable forward movement. Okay, so you'll see that when you're running. So as this individual is running, I don't own the rights to any of these pictures, so if you ask, that's the answer. As you see this individual running, you'll see that her right arm is coming back just as her left leg is coming back. So opposing sides are working at the same time to create that synergistic movement. So when she plants down with her right foot, she will toe off and her left arm will come back. So the glute and the lat are working together to create that motion. And that is why you'll notice that whenever you're training an isolated hamstring, it's always best to put your foot into plantar flexion. Because when your foot's in plantar flexion, the hamstring can function with flexion at the knee in a much more efficient manner. Okay? And you'll see the same thing when someone's sprinting. Here you can see it in a more defined picture. When he plants off onto this left foot, his right arm is going to drag back, activating these lats, and his glute is going to pull that leg back into extension to propel him forward. So the posterior oblique sling is developed for that specific purpose, to run in a sagittal plane. And there will be some sort of transverse rotation at sort of the thoracic region here, but for the most part, that system is developed for explosive sagittal power. Okay? And you can see the same thing. Ronda Rousey, she's awesome. You can see the same thing when someone's punching. So her left arm is being dragged back as her right arm comes forward, creating that sling. And after she's done this right punch, she's going to drag her right arm back, and her left glute will pull that system back into place. And it's all about balance, right? If you throw a punch and you throw it too hard and come over and inhibit the opposing glute, then you can't come back. And that's why if you ever take professional boxing lessons, your coach will probably tell you to stay nice and upright with a neutral spine. It's very uncommon these days for people to advocate the hollow body technique because you just don't get that sling activity. Okay, so moving on, I wanted to talk about a couple of exercises that would work really, really well for developing the superficial back line. And this is my favorite. It's called a sumo squat, or sumo deadlift, pardon me. And so it's a traditional deadlift, but the feet are out further and the toes are slightly pointed out. As you'll see here, I don't advocate wearing these toe shoes. They're stupid, but we'll continue. And you'll notice that her hands, I'd suggest putting both of your hands in supinated grip. She has the switch grip going on here, but I'd suggest putting both your hands in a supinated grip, and that way you'll stay in thoracic extension up top here with scapula back and neutral. She can drop her hips a little bit more, and she's leaning a little bit too far forward. But the picture illustrates a pretty good picture of what sort of stance you should be doing. And you're going to drive through your heels, standing up with the bar. And that's for developing the superficial back line. You'll see here the difference between a traditional deadlift, where the individual is sort of down and he's driving most of his force from the low back and the glutes. Whereas doing the sumo squat, you're going to get a lot of your power from the hamstrings, pushing your knees back into extension. So that's why it's more of a isolated exercise for the hamstrings and the gluteus maximus. Okay, the last exercise I wanted to talk about here, and this is a really bad illustration of it, but I couldn't find anything else online, is a unilateral cable row. So essentially the idea behind here is that she's going to create the same motion that you would make when you're running. And that would be that the left arm is getting pulled back, just as the right leg, the opposing leg, is going into extension at the hip, right? Because that's the function of the hamstrings. The hamstrings are a multifunction muscle. They do flexion at the knee and extension at the hip. Whenever you're training hamstrings, you should do both. But continuing on, her left arm will pull back just as her right leg goes into extension. And when she pulls back, she's going to drive the same side as the arm up. And there's a lot more range of motion that can happen here. But for now, this is a great exercise for developing that sling, the posterior oblique sling. So moving back to this image here, this is what I wanted to talk about. So the superficial back line, A, is composed of the gastroc, the hamstrings, the erector spinae group, and the levator scapulae. Levator scapulae being the muscle at birth that helps the child lift its head. Without lifting its head, it's very difficult to function. And then the posterior oblique sling, which is a band of muscles that form sort of a synergistic motion of the opposing groups functioning at the same time. So that'll be the arm dragging back, for example, the right arm dragging back, and the left leg going into extension. And so that's the confusion behind the posterior chain per se. Where does that leave you when you're doing a workout? Well, just keep in mind what you're actually training, right? If you're only doing something in the sagittal plane like deadlifts, you can't really expect to be improving these slings that work mostly with rotational forces, right? So if you want to develop these slings really, really efficiently, then I would suggest going online and searching up someone like Naudi Aguilar at Functional Patterns, and he does a lot of exercises where he's moving in the transverse plane, rotating, developing these slings. But if you're into powerlifting, you're not going to be developing these slings very well. You're going to be developing this static sort of postural muscles. All right, thanks guys.